Well, hello everyone. Thank you. First of all, a big thank you to our hosts for inviting me to give this provocatively entitled presentation. You are watching it wrong, but it's not your fault. I'm not sure how I'm going to dig myself out of that hole, but I'm going to give it a shot nonetheless. So I know a lot of you in the room, actually, from my time at Elemental. I was very lucky enough to spend some time at that company. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Griggs. I've been in the Portland area. Thanks, Mum. I've been lucky enough to be involved in the Portland tech community for, well, I guess since about 2008. Started a career at Grass Valley and Elemental, both pre and post acquisition, and then most recently at the Walt Disney Company. This is a good time to point out that these opinions I'm talking about tonight are my own and not my employer's. And we're going to really discuss quite a broad topic tonight. We're going to focus on one aspect of it, but in general terms, we're going to address or begin to look at addressing the problem space of how we set up content, and specifically filmic or cinematic content for success in home viewing environments. Because when we think about how we watch content at home, it doesn't resemble a movie theater in just about every aspect. Ambient light, untreated sound conditions. And so how do we start to think about as an industry to set up content for success so that we can enjoy it in a more theatrical-like way in a home environment? So hugely broad subject for which we don't have the time to cover in its entirety in just a few slides and 30 minutes, but we're going to focus on one aspect of it which is very close to my heart and is specifically related to motion. Now, when we think about motion as video engineers, we're often very focused on things like motion artifacting from long GOP encoding and temporal encoding and temporal compression. That's not what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about something way more fundamental. We're talking about something that's as fundamental as animation itself, and that is judder. Now, because of basically 100+ years of cinematic entertainment, we have become, for purely historical reasons, conditioned to associate storytelling, particularly cinematic storytelling, with a certain look and feel. And we could spend a lot of time talking about things like aspect ratio. We could spend a lot of time talking about things like grain preservation. But one of the most important things that puts us and our minds into this storytelling mode is frame rate. And that frame rate for 100 years now has been 24 frames per second. And the reason, and this is just me opining on this a little bit, as to why that's important is because at 24 frames per second, the illusion just starts to break up. This illusion of fluid, smooth motion, we get a small look behind the curtain, and we start to understand the trickery. And it's part of that, as counterintuitive as that sounds, that puts our minds into this mode of suspension of disbelief, taking things on face value and enjoying a story. And when that's broken, as it so often is, unfortunately, in home entertainment applications, particularly around cinematic content, it can be quite a disturbing and disruptive experience that can take us out of that storytelling mode in the same way as we are when we're watching sports or news. And it's somewhat a relatively high, it's a huge detriment in some cases to the quality of the overall experience. And part of the problem is that, to some extent, and I don't want to speak too broadly here, there is a kind of lift and shift attitude when it comes to how we think about the transposition of cinematic content into home entertainment environments. Clearly, there is home entertainment authoring for movies. But in some cases, in cases we're going to explore here, we're not taking advantage of or even leaning into the performance of high-quality displays, which are increasingly prevalent across our viewers. So it's really a question of screens and mastering. When a theatrical release is produced at 24 frames per second, which, as we've said, is an important part of the overall filmic look for a piece of content, it's typically being designed for the hero viewing experience, which is in a movie theater. And movie theaters are very dark rooms with treated walls, a sound-treated environment, and generally speaking, notwithstanding some of the newer 3D HDR experiences that we get in Dolby theaters, etc., around about 48 nits of overall brightness. Compare that to your $200 Costco TV. It starts at around 200, and I have a 1,000 nit screen at home, if you can believe it. Anyone that's had a chance to look at some of this new QD OLED technology will no doubt agree that it is beautiful looking, but it is massively, in some cases, exponentially brighter than a cinema screen. And whilst in many cases we've lent into the performance of consumer electronic displays or consumer displays, there are some inherent properties in these very same displays which allow judder to be amplified, or actually amplify the effect of judder to the point where it becomes uncomfortable. So unlike grain, and unlike resolution, and unlike aspect ratio, that when they leave the mastering or finishing facility, travel through the supply chain and end up on your screen, generally remain intact, the judder, or more importantly, the eye's perception of judder, is mutable. It can change, and it can be aggravated and amplified, in some cases attenuated by different effects. And those effects are things people like. So, for example, resolution, overall brightness of a display, dynamic range, physical size. These are all things that you'd want to see on the side of a box when you're going to select a TV. You know, how bright is it? Does it have HDR? Is it 4K? And yet these are the very same things which can have an amplification effect on the perception of judder, to the point where, and it's very content specific, to be clear, it's not every scene, where it can result in a very uncomfortable experience known as strobing, where you're seeing motion essentially stutter very dramatically across the screen, and essentially can, as I say, can be quite detrimental to the overall quality of the viewing experience. And these things are not going away. Well, we can have a philosophical debate about whether the motion picture industry is, you know, and people watching content in movie theaters is going to rebound, and sure, there's going to be some ebb and flow to that. But what is not going to change is the affordability and accessibility of high-quality displays in people's homes. And so we have to, as an industry, start to lean into that in order to ensure that when we're thinking about how theatrical presentations, and I really am talking about cinematic content here, is set up for success in the home. So let's just take a look at this at a little bit of a technical perspective. Generally speaking, there was an old rule of thumb around 7-second pan for a 48 nit screen. And you can see here what this chart does on the y-axis is this is the judder. It's normalized at 1, so everything above the 1 line is considered unacceptable, everything below is acceptable. The different colored lines represent different pan speeds, which introduce motion into the scene. And then the x-axis is the peak white point, or effectively nits of a screen. And you can see that even in the slowest case of a 21-second pan, once we get over 500 nits, which, by the way, is not exactly a premium feature in TVs anymore, you're going to start to see a level of judder in high motion, high contrast scenes that becomes unacceptable. And so this distills down to the need to transpose a 7-second pan to nearly 25 seconds in order to maintain an acceptable level of judder on a 1,000 nit screen. That's quite a dramatic change when we consider where we were even just 10 years ago. Now, hang on a second. I'm not suggesting that we don't, as a business, author content for the home entertainment environment. Of course we do. It's not like we just take the cinematic, finished piece of content and just ship it to the home. Of course, there is a process of authoring it specifically for the home entertainment environment. And in many respects, as an industry, we do really well here when it comes to taking advantage of the dynamic range of consumer displays. We do a great job. Gamut and bit depth, again, we do a great job. And we certainly do a good job of authoring for spatial resolution. But where we don't, and where we fall short as an industry today, is that when it comes to the temporal resolution, essentially the frame rate, we do not lean into the power of consumer displays, resulting in the amplification of judder to the point where it becomes unacceptable and, as I said, can be a significant detriment to the overall viewing experience of that content. So we're not keeping up as an industry. So where are we now then? So where does that leave us today? Well, we can continue to watch content at 24 frames per second, and we can disable all of those high value proposition features that we've invested in our new TV sets. We can use modes like filmmaker mode to essentially take care of all of that for us. Or we can use a technology at the other end of the spectrum called motion smoothing. And we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into both of these now. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these are two extremities that, and it's my, I guess, hypothesis that neither of them in isolation are a solution to the problem. And yet this is the only thing we have available to us today in order to mitigate the problem of uncontrolled or unwanted judder in cinematic experiences at home. So I think everyone's probably at least heard of motion smoothing. As essentially a reaction to the problem space that we're describing, TV manufacturers some years ago, now going back to early plasmas really, started introducing technology to compensate for this inherent judder that is amplified by the very features that they're selling their consumers. And this technology, in broad sense, is called motion smoothing. Every vendor has their own name for this. But essentially, it's all distilled down to some kind of frame interpolation. A technology that attempts to resolve the disparity of the inherent frame rate to the refresh rate of the TV. And the problem with it is, it's a valiant attempt, don't get me wrong. And I think in many cases and for many consumers, it's likely a better outcome than not turning it on. But the challenge with this frame interpolation is an algorithm. It has no expression of creativity, understands nothing about the intent of the filmmaker. How could it? And so what it does valiantly, but ultimately I believe ineffectively, is it interpolates the frames to try and bring some smoothness. Now the problem here is that it doesn't control the judder, it eliminates it. It's gone. And when it's gone, we've lost that filmic look and feel, or a key element of that filmic look and feel. And I'm sure many of you have dealt with either yourselves or relatives who have asked you, what's wrong with my new $800 TV? Why does it look like this? And often it's the case that they've got some kind of frame interpolation running, and it has that kind of plasticky, sometimes referred to as the soap opera effect, video game effect, look and feel. It's too realistic. It reminds us of a sports telecast. It reminds us of news or something that doesn't have that filmic look and feel, and it's disruptive to our mindset and our enjoyment of a piece of cinematic content because it doesn't look like cinema anymore. So in itself, and look, I have to say, this is not a static technology. This isn't like we haven't reached peak motion smoothing. This is something that's going to continue to evolve, and manufacturers are doing quite, I think, great jobs in trying to do a better version of this that's not so disruptive to that filmic look and feel. And I think the next, more recent generations of this technology are definitely doing better, but they're always going to fall short of that expression of creativity, which I think is so important when it comes to representing cinematic content at home, is that we want that story to be told holistically, not just the narrative and the dialogue, but also how it looks and how it feels is so much part of a movie experience that if that's lost through some kind of algorithmic interpolation, we're sort of tearing some of the effectiveness or the legs off of a presentation. So motion smoothing is a polarizing subject. Some people love it. Some people love it because it's the only solution they have to the problem. But in itself, I don't think holistically solves the problem that we're trying to address. And filmmakers do care. As do audiences. I mean, you don't have to do too much digging on your favorite search engine to find plenty of commentary from folks up and down the supply chain about the evils of frame interpolation, or vice versa. But the point is, this is not something that's going amiss. People do care about the impact this is having on the effectiveness of the storytelling. And in that, and as I guess as an answer to that, the UHD Alliance and some very prominent creatives such as Christopher Nolan, I think Martin Scorsese was involved, came up with a solution. Again, I don't want to be overly dismissive of filmmaker mode. It is, of itself, a valiant attempt to try and solve a very real problem. But again, my hypothesis is, in isolation, as it stands at least, it's not a holistic solution. So for those of you who don't know what filmmaker mode is, I'm sure most of you do, this is a collection of settings which essentially disables all of that stuff that you've paid $800 for. So it's turning off motion smoothing, it's setting a white point, it's doing a bunch of stuff in a way that's, and I get it, it comes from a good place, right? It comes from a place of let's make a TV set look and feel like a $25,000 X300 in a finishing suite in someone's home. The problem is that the average home is not a finishing suite. And people don't want to watch films at midnight with the lights off. They want to watch films in the daytime with a big bright fluorescent light over their heads and, and maybe multiple windows open. And filmmaker mode, unfortunately, because it turns off a lot of this post-processing that attempts to resolve, again, ineffectually, attempts to resolve the judder problem, needs to bring down the overall brightness as its only tool to control the judder, because remember, brightness is one of the most significant contributors to unwanted judder. So when it's doing that, it's essentially creating, a relatively polarizing experience. And I have to say, in my house, we tend to opt for the motion smoothing, because for us, also having a young kid, right, probably doesn't care as much as I do about this sort of thing. In fact, I know he doesn't. It's the lesser of the two evils. Like, the frame interpolation works. It's not perfect. It's annoying at times, but at least we can watch TV under normal viewing conditions. So one of the biggest criticisms of filmmaker mode is that it is, yes, a good attempt at creating something that looks very close to a reference monitor. But the problem, I think, where it misses is that those conditions needed to enjoy a presentation on a reference monitor need to be reference conditions, and most homes are not. Excuse me, I'm trying to get over this cold. So I think about filmmaker in I don't even think it's that controversial a way. I think if we chart the spectrum of happiness of end viewers and filmmakers, I feel like for me, filmmaker mode is heavily indexed on making filmmakers very happy, because when they look at it on a $500 TV next to an X300 or some other high quality Sony reference display, and it looks similar in those reference conditions, that makes them feel good, right? That's my vision. The problem is when you take that same TV and you put it into an average home, the experience is quite different. And I think that's where there's an opportunity for us as an industry for improvement. So, sounds like we're in trouble, right? We've got two essentially polar opposite solutions to a problem related to motion control and judder control in a home, and neither of them, at least according to David, solves the problem. Well, 5 years ago, maybe even a little bit more than that, that would probably be true. But I believe there is a solution to this. But it isn't a simple one, unfortunately, as things rarely, as is often the case in our industry. High frame rate and motion grading. Well, hang on a second. Didn't I just say that 24 frames per second is what makes film? And I think that answer is still yes. But we have to start now to think about high frame rate, or thinking about frame rate in two different ways. Perceived frame rate, and then what is the containing frame rate that actually allows us to do some magic, which can help with motion and motion artifacting and judder control. So high frame rate on its own is not the headline here. It's an interesting technology. It's been used actually by filmmakers for some time now to varying degrees of success. I think we can all agree that objectively. I don't know if folks had an opportunity to see the theatrical presentation of The Hobbit, but it was shot, I think at 48. I'm not entirely sure. I could be wrong about that. Apologies, Peter. You know, it's quite a polarizing experience because it was just high frame rate, and it had in the cinema the same kind of experience folks have with motion smoothing, in that it presented this kind of hyper-realistic video game-like feel, which for some folks liked, but the vast majority of people found non-filmic and felt like they were watching. It somewhat cheapened the experience for a lot of viewers. So it's not exactly HFR itself that is the headline here. The headline really is something we're, as an industry, starting to call motion grading. So we do a lot of grading in finishing and mastering in the motion picture industry. Think about color grading, it's a good example. This kind of sits somewhere in that same space. The point being, motion grading is a creative tool set. It's not something done by an algorithm downstream at the presentation layer. It's done as part of the finishing process of a movie. And in some cases, like the movie we're looking at right here, it's part of the production process of the movie. But the point is, it's a tool set that allows a creative team to express motion in a finished product designed for a certain range of displays, including a broad range, perhaps the broadest of all, when it comes to consumer displays. So this is a new tool set. Doesn't really exist in any modern movie production workflows today. It's very nascent, but there are some early adopters, as we're going to look at here. So what's the difference between motion graded high frame rate and just high frame rate? Well, this is a sort of somewhat crude example, but I think it illustrates the point quite well. It's very difficult to show a demonstration of motion on slide deck, but this is what we came up with. So 24 frames a second, a lot of judder, a lot of blur, not particularly pleasing experience. High frame rate only, overly sharp, overly crisp, creating a kind of video game soap opera type effect. And then motion graded, which is a creatively sourced application of a certain amount of judder, a certain amount of motion in a scene where needed, and that's important, we'll come back to that, that keeps that filmic look we associate with 24 frames per second, but being carried by a container frame rate that's higher than that. So that's interesting. So how do we actually make this happen, right? This sounds like a great idea. I guess the proposal here is we can enjoy things like high dynamic range. We can enjoy bright screens of 800 nits and above. We can enjoy high resolution. We can enjoy viewing angles. We can enjoy big screens. And we still keep and maintain that cinematic look and feel of content. That sounds great. Let's just do it, right? Well, you know, it's going to take some effort. And so when we think about the industry support, there's a few key points I wanted to bring out. First of all, we need a tool set. We need someone to invent the technology that actually does this. And the good news is there are some very fine players in this space. So Pixelworks, which I think holds a very special part in Portland's history, mostly because founders of Elemental were all employees of the Pixelworks before they started their own venture here with Elemental Technologies. They have a technology known as True Cut Motion. I've been lucky enough to see some motion graded content that has resulted from this tool set. It looks great. So they provide a tool set that sits right in that post or finishing and mastering environment that allows creatives to actually grade content specifically for different distribution formats, including ranges of consumer displays. So we have a company, that's great news. We have a company that is manufacturing a tool set that does the job. But we need we need production companies and studios to actually use it. If they don't use it, it's no good. And you know, anybody that's looking at this today would say it's a very nascent space, right? We're not seeing broad and mass adoption of these tools and technologies yet, but they're only really just starting to surface in terms of awareness. But there are some very notable exceptions. Lightstorm, Cameron's production company, was a prolific user of motion-graded high frame rate on Avatar 2. And importantly, in their use case, because the hero version of that movie was 3D, you know, Dolby, laser projected, HDR in the theaters, they needed that technology even in theater productions, just movie theater productions, just to keep the judder under control, particularly for some of those underwater scenes. So whilst we've been talking a lot about home entertainment applications here for things like motion grading, it can have a place in movie theaters as we start to push past that 48 nits that we've been so used to for many years in a movie theater experience. But Lightstorm, as wonderful as a company they are not going to make an industry, well, I don't think, maybe James Cameron would disagree with that, maybe even take issue, but it's going to take a broader adoption in order for us to get the traction needed to get the rest of the industry excited about it. But in my belief, it has to start with creatives because they are the ones that need to be vested in ensuring that the content they make looks as great in the movie theaters as it does in the home. Because, you know, I think we could all agree that more and more home consumption of content is becoming, you know, it's becoming more dominant. And whilst we can have a philosophical debate about whether the movie theater business is going to rebound, and I'm sure it will to some extent, it's definitely not going to go back to the way it was 10 years ago. And we're definitely going to start to see streaming and disc-based distribution of AAA titles like this being consumed for the first time in the home. And so as an industry, we have to react to that. We have to lean into that. We have to accept the fact that streaming and disc distribution and home entertainment is a primary market for our industry, not a sell-through, not a secondary market. So we need the studios to engage. And, you know, honestly speaking, the praise for Avatar 2 was pretty much universal. Their use of high frame rate video was pretty much universally praised. And this is, I want to bring up a small point here, because sometimes this technology gets called VFR. And I want to explain that for a little bit, because although the container for this is 48 frames per second, they don't have to use each of those frames they don't have to process each of those frames with motion grading ubiquitously and uniformly throughout the movie. It's the problem of strobing and the problem of undesirable judder is not something that occurs throughout a movie. It's very content specific. High contrast and high motion being two of the biggest contributors from a content perspective to this problem. So the beauty of having a tool set in the hands of creatives and not an algorithm is that they can apply the technology where it's needed, and where it's not, they stay away from it. So in the case of Avatar 2 being a 48 frames per second piece of content, in many cases it's perceived 24 because they want that filmic look. But where the scenes demanded it, and particularly in some of these underwater scenes, you know, where there was a need to create and to control some of that judder in those high contrast, high motion scenes, they could use the technology selectively. And so that sometimes gives rise to the notion of this being a variable frame rate, VFR, because, you know, sometimes the headroom inherent in 48 frames per second is used. In other cases, it's just doubled and lives as a perceived 24. So you kind of preserve that filmic look and feel, but you've got the headroom in the higher frame rate to use motion grading to control judder when it's needed, and when it's not, you just stay out of it. So it's starting to sound like a really nice solution to the problem. This is kind of a big one. HDMI, no support, no real native support for 48 hertz, at least not today, at least not last time I checked. Someone in this room can tell me if I'm wrong about that. I mean, it can be done, right, with some custom needed stuff, but it's still a little bit, you know, hacky. TVs, broadcast, you know, not a huge user of 48 hertz. So we've got some challenges there. And I think if you want the hero experience of this, and by the way, 48 frames per second is somewhat arbitrary, right? It seems to be adopted in the motion picture industry because it's twice 24, right? So it's nice and easy. But in reality, you know, there's nothing prescriptive about that. It's not a requirement. You know, the high frame rate is just headroom. It could be 60, it could be 50. But for now, at least, the motion picture industry is orienting around 48. For reasons hopefully are obvious. But it's not particularly well aligned with the refresh rates on most TVs. There's a lot out there that do 24. And of course, it doesn't have to be 48. It could just be an integer divisible number of 48 as well, of course. That being said, I've seen motion graded content at 48 frames per second running at 60 hertz. And whilst, yes, You are going to have, some pull down, uneven judder introduced by the, the disparity between the frame rate and the refresh rate of the TV. That is by far a second order problem. Like, that is not really the problem we're talking about here. Yes, it's not the perfect Cadillac experience of this technology, but 95% of the problems that we've been discussing in this presentation are still solved, even if it's being rendered at 60 hertz with pull down or whatever technology is being deployed. Not motion smoothing though. So I think but the desire is there to have support for a native refresh rate of 48 hertz in TVs. And based on the folks I've talked to, there's interest, but like everyone else, they want to know where's the content. And of course, where's the distribution support? And that's really the third leg to this stool, is that if we're going to make a success of a technology like this that attempts to thread that needle in allowing customers, viewers, to get the best out of the TVs they've spent lots of money on, and still get a filmic experience in regular living room conditions, it's going to take a fairly Herculean effort across the entire supply chain, production, distribution, and display, to really make this work. And as we stand today, none of it's really there. There's a lot of talk and a lot of interest, but we're really, I think, and as I said earlier, I think this really needs to start with a prolific use of the technology by creatives, and if creatives are demanding that that their films are being displayed in this more authentic way on consumer displays, then the industry will fall into place, in my opinion. And we will start to see a lot more of this content and be able to enjoy a lot more of this content in a more movie theater, cinematic, filmic way, but in regular homes across the world. So I wanted to leave time for some questions. I did want to put up some further reading here. If anyone's interested in just the general a technical overview of the article, I realize these are all links. I'm not even sure if this deck gets shared or not, so this might be completely useless. So if we're not sharing the deck, I'll send out a note with the links. There's a link to the TrueCut Motion website. Definitely, if you've not spent any time with this technology and you're interested in how motion grading works and how it can be used for both, theatrical and in-home entertainment applications, take a look. And then there's also some great demos on YouTube. You don't need to have a fancy 48 hertz display. If anyone's got a Mac, you can usually get it to do it pretty easily. And I found those to be quite compelling. You sort of get some examples of some 24 frames, fully motion smoothed, and then a graded experience of the same scene, kind of back to back. And it's that when you really start to see the difference then between, essentially a raw 24, a fully motion smooth 60, and then or 48, and then a motion graded 48. So I highly recommend checking out the links. And if anybody's interested in getting access to this deck, I'm sure I can make that available. I'm not sure how I did on time, but not too bad, I think. So I wanted to leave time for some questions, and thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. With the kind of emerging stuff with 3D, as in like Apple Vision Pro and Meta Quest Pro 3, does the judder change, and is the 48 FPS stuff more beneficial in 3D than it is in 2D?
Someone had to bring up the Apple question. So I need to be a bit careful. But no, so yes, the answer to your question is absolutely yes. When you are looking at stereoscopic content, you've essentially got twice the brightness. I mean, all things being equal. So that's definitely another amplifier to the problem. And in fact, as I mentioned, the 3D release of Avatar 2 used that motion grading technology for theatrical releases because of that very same problem. We weren't in a 48 nit kind of environment anymore. So yes, the 3D and HDR particularly are aggravating factors that contribute to unwanted judder in presentations, yeah, absolutely. And less controlled, yeah. Lionel.
So I'm going to be even more controversive as your title. Who gives a fuck about cinema theaters?
Oh, I didn't know we could swear.
pardon my French.
Like,
Pardon my French.
It's been a whole
But
different presentation.
I mean, the whole principle is we're still keeping 24 frames per second because of the cinema theater industry. But 2024 and beyond, nobody will. I mean, in 2030, nobody will go to cinema theaters anymore. So maybe the content should be created for home consumption first. If you go to a gas station, they don't care about cars that were created 150 years ago. They don't support that anymore. So why do the cinema directors don't think about home consumption first?
Oh boy. I was told there
you.
were going to be some tough questions, and this is a really good point. You know, so I think if I want to just distill down what you're saying, look, let's just forget about this 24 crap because movie theaters are dead.
Yeah, it's a thing of the past.
And we should just make films at 60 or 30 or okay. Well, I can't speak for the motion picture industry at that level, but I think I'll say this. You're right to say, as an industry, that we need to start thinking. By we, I mean everyone from creatives through to distributors through to TV manufacturers. Well, not so much TV; they're already well in that camp. But they need to start thinking about home entertainment as being a primary market versus a secondary one. I totally agree with that. And we could have an existential discussion about the all-you-can-eat buffet version that is streaming today, which I'm not going to get into for various self-preservation reasons, but I think you make a good point. I think the challenge is you're talking about 100 years of history, and that's not going to change overnight. We're not going to convince Martin Scorsese that he should be shooting at 30 or 60. And whilst we could sit here in Portland and
I don't. Yeah. So Jeffrey Katzenberg, he tried to do that with Quibi, right? He was trying to get a new way of consuming content that is more bite-sized and more in line with today's ways of consuming content. And he failed hard. Why?
Well, I mean, I think arguably he was taking 4 steps instead of 1, right? And I think that's the challenge. And I think what I like about this technology is that it caters to an artistic whim, right? In other words, you're dealing with artists that are not super, this is not true universally, but are not super necessarily interested in the various permutations of home entertainment displays, but it gives them the tool set that speaks their language. I mean, when you're using a tool set like motion grading, you're talking about shutter angle, right? And other forms of terminology that they're used to in a production space. It gives them that tool set, but allows them to then translate that into something that will work on the vast majority, or work better on the vast majority of home displays. That to me feels like a good first step. And then perhaps we can have a conversation with them. Well, maybe it would be a lot easier if we used a more TV-friendly format in production. But that feels like the conversation we have 5 years from now, not today. But look, I agree with you. I agree with you at a certain level. But I'm also, working where I work, there is an enshrinement of creative intent, right? We want to be respectful of filmmakers because it's an art form. And if that art form is prescriptive about a frame rate, well, who am I to tell them they're wrong about that? So I think there is room to cater for that. And as technologists, if we can bring about technology that allows them to work in that world, no matter how archaic we may think it is from a purely technical basis, and yet still deliver content that is viewable and enjoyable by millions, that's got to be a good thing, right? And I think trying to take it to the sort of like, it's more like taking the, make sure I get this analogy right, it's bringing Muhammad to the mountain, not the other way around. Yes.
It was just a comment on that, and I think it's a which I think you've said, it's an art v technology conflict. And to the analogy you said, like, I know from my background, like, Jeremy Clarkson on Top Gear was like, petrol cars, that's where it's at. Even if an electric car has got better performance, they want the feel of the old. Because that's the mindset, that's the nostalgia, that's how it runs. Filmmakers are looking at, Christopher Nolan will be like, oh no, I want to be practical effects. Even if special effects looks better, I want to do it in real life because that's art. I want to do 24 frames a second because that's art. So to David's point, like, maintaining that artistic integrity, even if technology can do better, seems to be what they want to do.
But I also think tastes can change.
Yeah.
The fact that The Hobbit was looking like a video game, you have millions and millions, hundreds of millions of video game titles sold every year, and people are ready to pay for that.
You know, you could make the argument that that was a deliberate choice on Peter Jackson's part to make it seem more like a video game. I don't know if that's true, but
But I think it can be accepted as a new standard for.
listen, if I thought 5 years ago we'd all be watching TV with subtitles on because of TikTok, I would have laughed at you. But I mean, that's kind of where we're at, right? And I feel like it's, you know.
So,
Yeah, just for the sake of time, folks, let's have that conversation over beers
Sure,
and break,
sorry.
and let's move on. We got time for one more or two more.
So this is an easy technical question.
Oh, really?
Okay, yes.
I doubt that somehow.
No, absolutely is. Okay, you said your suggestion is 48 frames per second at 60 hertz. I don't understand what the at 60 hertz means. Like, what would it be in a 50 hertz country, or how does it relate to the hertz part?
All I was suggesting is that the uneven judder introduced by a disparity between frame rate of the content, i.e. what it's being served at in a streaming environment, and the natural refresh, or the chosen refresh rate of the TV, is a second order problem when it comes to the judder that I was describing. There is obviously a concept of uneven judder, which is an artifact introduced by that disparity. But that, in my opinion, and I think somewhat objectively, is a second order problem when compared to the judder that's inherent in the source content and desirable in a source content that gets amplified by things like brightness. So I was just trying to draw a distinction to the fact that if we're in a world where 48 at 60 or even 50, it's likely not the end of the world from an overall holistic solution perspective. It's not ideal, but it's not the thing that's going to kill it. That's what I meant. Yeah. Okay, one more sneaky one.
Yeah, well, so thank you for the presentation. Certainly, there's the Martin Scorsese, got to convince the creatives to kind of go this way thing. But from a technology perspective, when I look at a kind of a streaming distribution chain, it's not hard to do 48 frames per second. Pick your frame rate. We can figure that out. In terms of the content production creative process, you cited like Pixelworks. So that does motion grading. But when I think of other forms of like post production, the tools are just like DaVinci Resolve, Flame. Like all these tools are there. So how much of the problem of kind of going this direction is involved in the tool set and the fact that like there's only a few things available?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. It is nascent across the board. Pixelworks happened to, I think, probably be one of the few that have really invested heavily in this, if not the only. And that tool set fits exactly in that part of the finishing that you're talking about, right? And with the colorist workflow. It doesn't need to start with production. I mean, Cameron's Lightstorm stuff, like for A2 at least, that was all 48 native, right? They shot it there. But you can also take 24 and double it and start there, right? And then start motion grading from there. So that's kind of, I think, why the 48 is so dominant in Hollywood, is because they can take the entire 100 years back catalog of 24, just start by frame doubling to get a perceived 24 at a 48 container, and then use motion grading selectively within the entirety of the movie where it's needed, but not otherwise. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's a nascent technology that doesn't exist and is not part of mainstream post workflows today. And that needs to change if we're going to really make it. And also to your last point, yeah, from a distribution, whether that's physical disc or streaming, we got the easy job. It's just like, we can make 48, like, that's not the hard part. The hard part is getting creatives to embrace it, and to some extent OEMs to embrace the refresh rate to get that kind of absolute premium, experience. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.